All right, hello everybody. The kind of start that can only happen when I need to cough right as I'm starting. Today, this week, I am talking about a book called New Arabian Nights by Robert Louis Stevenson. And I have to apologize to any Stevenson fans. I had at some I haven't read much of what he's written. I think I read Treasure Island once as a kid, long time ago. But I somehow had in my head the idea that he was an American author, and actually he's Scottish. So, I may have said something or, whatever. I don't know, somehow the adventurous tone of his stuff made me think he was kind of a late 1800s American author, but anyway. So this is a collection, this book, New Arabian Nights, is in 2 volumes, and we're only talking about volume 1 because volume 1 by itself was already 300 and some pages, or very close to it. These are a collection of short stories, which was published in 1882, and it collects stories that Stevenson wrote between 1877 and 1880. So, he wrote them in such a way that they were publishable, piecemeal, basically, as opposed to, someone could write a book where the book was set up as a series of short stories that were really just chapters. But I think that but I'm pretty sure that these stories were published, one by one at different times over that 4-year period. Now, the people who research Robert Louis Stevenson say that, and I'm quoting from a wiki, which is quoting from a book by someone else, where Robert Louis Stevenson, or this book in particular, is called "A Pioneering Works in the English Language Short Story Tradition." And, it's interesting because Stevenson wrote these works one at a time and published them, and they were a series in a sense, but all of a sudden he came to a strong desire to publish them all together in a book. And you might ask, well, why is that? Well, we actually get the first hint about that, and I guess the only hint about that, at the very introduction of his book, where he has a note that says this, quote, "I must prefix a word of thanks to the gentleman who condescended to borrow the gist of one of my stories, and even to honor it with the addition of his signature. This mark of appreciation emboldened me to make the present collection," end quote. So, there's a little bit of you immediately start with a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek kind of feel as Robert Louis Stevenson presents a big handful of his best short stories in book form. And there we go. So this particular volume collects 7 stories into 2 main narratives. It has that nested structure that I talked about when I was reviewing 3 Impostors, right? It mimics 1001 Nights, and the funny thing about this book is that Stevenson, at the end of each short story, he mentions a, quote, Arabian author at the end of every story, but he doesn't really play it up. There's no introduction where he's like, oh yes, I received... To contrast, when I was reading Don Quixote, the very first part of Don Quixote, there was a passage where Cervantes said, well, I had run out, I had missed out on this chunk of the story, but I was traveling somewhere and I found a manuscript and I translated the first few words and I realized that it was a collection of the stories that I had been missing, and I asked a young man to translate it for me, blah, blah, blah. Some authors who make this kind of format for their stories, where I am being told a story, we get this from Burroughs too, right? Like, for instance, in the Burroughs books, the ones that I've read, the Barsoom books, the few that I've read, Burroughs starts each book with a good number of pages kind of talking about his interactions with John Carter and kind of setting the Earth side of the story into play, whereas the main chunk of the book is, on Barsoom, Mars, and then at the end of the book we usually get a little bit more Earth stuff. In these stories, the reference to the Arabian author by Stevenson is usually no more than like a paragraph. It's very barely there, but it is there, so it's worth noting. This book is split, this particular volume of this book is split into 2 main stories. The first one is called The Suicide Club, and the second one is called The Raja's Diamond. But it turns out that all of these stories, all 7 of them, involve one major character who is the Prince Florizel of Bohemia in some way or another. He plays an active part in some of the stories and a less active part in others. The Prince Florizel is kind of a traveling gentleman, right? He has a royal seat, but he doesn't use it all the time. He often goes out and enjoys rubbing elbows in disguise with the common people. And because of this, he gets into a lot of trouble, or at least gets into a lot of situations where he discovers that if he removes the mask, so to speak, he can maybe do some good. And he's a genuinely good, nice, positive character, which is also a thing that is a little bit surprising because, in these books, a lot of the time the character is a little bit gray, but Florizel is very much not a morally gray kind of character. He is very much on the straight and narrow, very much the forces for good, and the people around him are more or less either forces for evil or unwittingly brought into the forces for evil. And as I read this book, I was actually kind of surprised, because when I was doing my review for the 3 Impostors, I was, everyone said, oh yeah, this is a lot like Stevenson's New Arabian Nights. It's very similar, very, very similar. But I feel like those people who said that were really kind of groping for similarities. If you had just called each of the, if Stevenson had simply given each of these short stories a chapter number, you could still write the same story. You just wouldn't have the kind of cute story names for the short stories. But even some authors that write in typical chapters, write names for their chapters. And, if I look at this book, and if I look at the 3 Impostors, they are so very, very different in tone, in style. Pretty much the only real similarity that they have is this kind of nested structure. And the nested structure was, something that popped up in 1001 Nights. So it's not like New Arabian Nights was the groundbreaker of this type of story, right? Or this type of story structure. And, even less so is the 3 Impostors an imitation of this book, because they're just very, very different. And I'll try to explain as much as I can of that without spoiling things. So let's try that. First off, in this book, the stories are not flashbacks like they are in the 3 Impostors. They're all present time narratives, at the time of the story, right? They're modern stories at the time. And, that changes things very much, because in the 3 Impostors, we also assume that because the stories are being told by the impostors for a ulterior motive, that the stories aren't actually true, or that a large chunk of them is actually fabricated. We believe that because of the way that the story is structured. In this book, we have no sense that a large chunk of this story has been fabricated in a meaningful way. We don't have an unreliable narrator, as far as I can tell. Even when we have a narrator who is not quite as straight and narrow as Florizel himself, we still don't get the hint that the narrator himself is unreliable in the way he's telling the story to us. And again, he's not telling the story in the past tense, in the far past tense, but in the near past tense, like, I went to the store today kind of thing. Second off, in this book, the good guys are actively trying to stop the bad guys, whereas in the 3 Impostors, the good guys were pretty much oblivious to the plans and plots of the bad guys, and the bad guys weren't targeting the good guys because they didn't know that the good guys had something that they wanted, right? So even there, the stories are different in the sense that the imposter stories were a tissue or a yarn ball of lies, and this book is basically truthful as far as it goes. And in the 3 Impostors, the 2 main characters were hilariously oblivious to what was going on and how they were being spun, these yarns, whereas in this book we do have some subterfuge, we do have some stealth and some confusion bits and stuff like that, but the whole thing is played pretty straight, and you're viewing it from the perspective of, if not the good guys, then someone who ends up on the side of the good guys. So we're not getting into the minds the bad guys for the most part in this book, which is another major difference, I think, in the way that the story flows and works, just kind of from a plot perspective. Another thing about this book compared to the Three Impostors is that the humor, what humor there was in the Three Impostors, mostly came from the obliviousness of the good guys. It was kind of indirect humor and very subtle, whereas in this book, the humor is more prevalent, more direct, and more, say, leaning in the silly direction. We get silly circumstances, we get some weird characters, we get some very strange circumstances that are that kind of beggar belief a little bit. But again, they're told in a way that suggests that that is how things happened. Another thing that we get in this book in particular are silly names, like to put it this way, the humor in New Arabian Nights is much less subtle than what humor there was in Three Impostors, which I think is another major effect on the tone. This book is relatively light, whereas the Three Impostors was relatively heavy or dark, whatever you want to call it. But, I'll just give you examples of some of the names. We have Silas Q. Scudamore. We have a colonel whose name is Geraldine Hammersmith, or maybe it's Hammersmith Geraldine, but we never get the character's name spoken out in one thing. It's either Colonel Geraldine or or he's like, oh, call me Hammersmith. So maybe Hammersmith is his first name. I don't know. It's a little strange, but we have Charlie Pendragon, which is a very lowbrow first name and a very highbrow, especially in England, last name. And we have Francis Scrimgeour, Scrymgeour. I don't know how to pronounce it. Probably you don't know how to pronounce it, but Stevenson must have had something in mind when he wrote it down. We get kind of strange and silly turns of phrase. For instance, at one point, I think it was Francis who was called I think it was Silas Q. Scudamore, who was called an elderly young man by Stevenson at some point. And I was like, wait a minute, right? We get a lot of mock gravity. Quote, there's a point where Florizel, Geraldine, and someone else, I forget who, Brackenbury, those three are and one other who I don't know if I know that character's name. They're basically trying to kind of stealth their way through a building, and we get this great little bit of mock gravity. Quote, "You will have the kindness," he said, Florizel speaking, "to maintain the strictest silence and to conceal yourselves in the densest of shadow." It's like, first off, if you're trying to be quiet and stealthy, you would point. You'd say, hey, hide over there. Hide over there, hide over there, hide over there, something like that. And you certainly wouldn't stop and say, you will have the kindness to blah, 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 blah. It's mock gravity, and it's funny. And there's a little bit of this here and there throughout the book. I'll cover the silly situations, what I want to cover, a little bit more in depth in the spoiler section, but suffice it to say that the tone of this book is a lot lighter than the Three Impostors. The other thing is that the style of writing is also very different, because where Arthur Machen was kind of the well-spoken poetic describer of things, right? I mentioned that sometimes he has these very large descriptions of things, but they're also very, very well written, right? They're very interesting to read, and they give you a lot of detail about the thing that he's describing. Stevenson in these books, or in these stories in particular, is a lot more, we'll say, slapdash. And not to a bad degree. I mean, he still, what he does is he has a gentlemanly tone, or a gentlemanly style, but not a poetic one. He's not trying to wow you with his ability to write especially beautiful prose, but he's trying to tell you a story. And in that sense, it has a little bit more of the raconteur and a little bit less of the poet to it. We also get some outdated words. There were some interesting cases where I had to kind of do a bit of a double take. For instance, at one point in the book, the word gratefully is used to mean in a way that is grating and not in a way that is grateful, which I found a little surprising, but that is apparently what it was meant to say. We get descriptions of characters in this book, of course, but they're a little bit more vague. One of the things that Machen did very carefully was in the very introduction of Three Impostors, he described each of the three impostors in turn and used some very specific words to describe them. In this book, in Stevenson's work here, we don't get that. We get much more floppy definitions or descriptions of characters, with a couple of exceptions, but generally speaking, when you're reading one of these stories, or when I was reading one of these stories, I sometimes had to guess, oh, is this character perhaps supposed to be this other character from a previous story? I'm not sure. I'll have to read on to find out, kind of thing. The plot of this book also plays out a lot more like a detective story than Impostors did. It's more adventurous than Impostors, too. There's more running around and trying to catch people and spying on this person and someone's whispering a secret to someone else who then takes it somewhere else, being put into a carriage and brought to an unknown address kind of thing. There's a lot of tension, like dramatic tension, and there's a lot of kind of the more bellicose adventureness to it, with one major exception. One thing that Stevenson does not do in this book pretty much at all is describe like large-scale or even small-scale action, which I found very surprising. There's actually a section of the book where he very much is like setting you up to wait for a sword fight to happen, and then he does the whole thing off-screen, so to speak. It was a little surprising to the point where I read it and saw that it was over and went back and reread it one or two more times to make sure I hadn't missed the fight. But apparently I hadn't. It just isn't there. So kind of not a great thing. But it never goes, and for this reason, it never becomes quite like the swashbuckling adventure that The Prisoner of Zenda was, right? It's different from that. One other thing about this set of stories is that the horror elements, where they are present, are entirely natural. In The Three Impostors, we got a little bit of the occult, a little bit of the supernatural, perhaps, right? And of course, because the stories are being told in such a way that the reader understands that they are stories and not necessarily expressions of the truth, so be it. But in this book, there's not really any sense of the supernatural anywhere. It's a very grounded book in that sense. When there are fearful elements, they are generally effective and pressing. We get a lot of tense scenes. We get a lot of people chasing other people, things like that. But at the same time, while we do get a lot of different scenarios and a lot of different characters in a lot of different places, we also lack we lack the depth of development that could have been done if instead Stevenson had chosen to focus on and expand on one of these particular short stories or one of the particular conflicts that we're talking about in these books. For instance, I've already said that the first few stories are titled, are kind of all collected under the title The Suicide Club, but I was very surprised how quickly the business of dealing with the Suicide Club happened, in a sense, right? I expected this to be kind of a long-running saga where, we're getting a little close, but he's escaped us. But we're looking here, we're doing this. But this is becoming more of a problem. We've got someone over here who's pushing us in the wrong direction, kind of thing. And in fact, instead of that kind of digging in, Stevenson kind of solves the problem and then pushes part of it off to the next story, basically. And I'll get more into that in the spoiler section. In fact, probably this is the place to start the spoiler section, and I'll do my usual thing where I talk a little bit about each story in turn, and then and you can skip that by going to the conclusion, the last chapter in the video. So here we go. All right. So part 1 of the Suicide Club is titled Story of the Young Man with the Cream Tarts. And this is a story that starts very silly, where Florizel and Geraldine are both at a bar, basically, a tavern, and they're in disguise, and they're pretending to just be regular people, and a young man walks in, and he's got these 2 giant plates of cream tarts, and he's offering them to people. He's like, oh, would you like a cream tart? And he does this thing where he's, very, kind of exaggeratedly polite. Some people take the tart, and some people don't take the tart. And if they don't take the tart, then the young man eats the tart that he offered and provides a new one to the next person that he offers. And, they get offered a cream tart by the young man, and they're kind of curious about what his motivations are. And so, being men of adventure, they're like, well, I will take your cream tart if you will spend the rest of the evening hanging out with us, and maybe we can learn a little bit more about why you're handing out cream tarts. And the young man himself is very kind of flippant and glib, and he doesn't seem like a very serious person. But then the story takes a very dark turn all of a sudden, because it turns out that what this young man is doing is he's basically frittering away the last bit of his fortune. And he's saying, I just need to get down to having 40 pounds left to my name, and then I can join the suicide club. And so Florizel and Geraldine are both interested of what, especially because like maybe this is something that's, that they need to deal with in a kind of a criminal sense, right? And what they discover, they both also claim that they are trying to get rid of their last bits of their fortune. Florizel burns a bunch of banknotes. Geraldine says, I only have a few, I have 80 pounds left and that's all I've got. They eat dinner together, and Geraldine tips the waiter like ridiculously well. And they're like, okay, we've got, 40 pounds to eat per person. Let's head to the suicide club and see what this is all about. And what we find is that it's not some kind of joke or anything like that. It's actually a very creepy idea where there's a bunch of people who get together who are actually too timid to commit suicide. And so the president of the suicide club basically plays a card game with them once a night, and whoever gets the ace of spades is the one who is to be killed, and whoever gets the ace of clubs is the one who is to do the killing. And this is a pretty dark idea, right? It's, effectively Russian roulette with people who claim that they want to die, but every day, someone else does, right? Some of them have been there for a while and never gotten the ace of spades kind of thing. And then there are people who've gotten the ace of clubs more than once. It's very kind of a creepy thing where people are being kind of morally corrupted without meaning to, in a sense, right? The guy is basically, the president is basically taking advantage of their desire to be done with life to turn all of them into murderers. It's a very neat idea, I thought. And this could have been the topic of a number of short stories where, this person got killed. Was this part of the club? Oh, this person, we caught him trying to commit a murder. Was this part of the club? You could have done all kinds of great kind of long-running mystery elements with that. But in fact, what happens is that Florizel, the second time that they go there, Florizel gets the ace of spades, and Geraldine, against orders, saves him by basically, as soon as he walks out of the house, grabbing him and throwing him grabs Florizel, who's in danger, throws him into a carriage, and then takes him back to the palace where he can put on his robes of office and stuff. And it's kind of funny because all the guys who are in the suicide club, except for the president, Florizel basically says, you guys, you were in this evil organization, you were in this evil club, but not by a desire of your own to commit evil against other people. So, I'm going to basically give all of you jobs and something to do that should make you not suicidal anymore. So they all get happy endings, but the president flees, and so now it's a question of, can we trace down the president and take care of him? And that leads us on to the second story, which now takes place in Paris. It's the story of the physician and the Saratoga trunk. And we move our point of view to New Englander Silas Q. Scudamore, who is basically spending a bunch of time in Paris to deliberately be useless and kind of pointless. And there's a woman who's a neighbor, who's his neighbor, who calls herself Madame Zephyrin. And there's no really better way to describe it than that he creeps out on her for a little while. It's not wholesome. There's a point where he discovers a tiny hole in the wall, and he enlarges the hole so that he can watch her comings and goings, basically. And there's no salacious content, but there's an implication that he may have seen. Who knows what he saw while he was watching. Eventually, she puts some stuff in front of the thing. And there's even this weird two-way thing where, like, she enlarges the hole to look through at him too. It's really weird and creepy, and not in like a occult horror way, but in like a I don't know, some kind of creeper way. What ends up happening is actually very strange too, because she kind of draws him into this kind of weird criminal-ish conspiracy, and like it's very vague. He never gets any real information. He's told to go here and wait for this person, or go here and bring this piece of paper to this person. He gets a lot of these weird little errands, and one of them ends with him returning home and discovering that there was someone he was supposed to tell the porter to let in if they came by while he was gone. And the porter's like, oh, that guy came, I hope you're not in debt with anyone, because we don't like to have people who are in debt at our hotel. And he's like, no, it's no problem. And he goes in, and what he actually finds is the guy's dead body in his bed. We get this whole dark conspiracy, and this Dr. Noel offers to help Silas out of this hole that he appears to be in. And the help involves Silas putting the body into this Saratoga trunk, a big luggage, and basically taking it over to Prince Florizel's company and going along with them so that he can get it past customs and bring it to London. And Dr. Noel gives him a piece of paper with an address on it, and is like, take it to this address. Don't let anyone else have it, kind of thing. Very creepy, very dark, and very not confusing to the reader, but very confusing from the perspective of the character, right? He basically says at one point, I'm at my hotel room and I have to carry this 200-pound bag up myself because I don't want to let anybody else carry it. And every night before I go to sleep, I'm around it and I'm kind of smelling at the edges of the box to make sure it's not starting to go sour. It's, very dark and creepy. But in a very, natural, in a very realistic way. And so we get this massive amount of dramatic tension. And, man, so I think that talking about the conclusion of this book, of this story, the story of the physician in the Saratoga trunk, would ruin the tension if you were to read this story. So I'm going to avoid giving you guys the conclusion of this story deliberately. Let's just say that there's a lot of tension because this guy's basically walking around with a dead body in a trunk, in a suitcase, and how it is resolved is, well, if I spoiled how it was resolved, you wouldn't feel the tension if you went and read the story. I'm always trying to get people to read stories, so we'll move on to the next story from here. And this is the final part of the Suicide Club series, and it's called The Adventure of the Hansom Cabs, where we are given the point of view of a man named Brackenbury. He's a military man, and he went to a party, and when he left the party, he kind of was walking down the street, and it started to rain. And, there's this carriage over there, and there's a guy who's, waving to him, the driver of the carriage. And he's like, well, I didn't call for a carriage, but, maybe I can at least stay out of the rain this way. So he, waves his cane and goes up to the thing. And there's this really weird exchange where Brackenbury gets into the carriage, and the cab driver, quote, "Where to, sir?" asked the driver. "Where you please," said Brackenbury. Now, I don't understand exactly why Brackenbury made that answer to the driver. It's not particularly clear. He could have said, "Take me to this place. It's a hotel," or something like that, right? But he says, "Where you please." And instead of, taking, I think it was kind of a joke, right? And so, but instead of laughing it off and saying, "No, sir, of course you need to tell me where we need to go," the driver just goes off. And Brackenbury's surprised by this. He's like, whoa, what have I got myself into? And he's taken to a strange house where there's this strange party going on. And it's weird. People are arriving and leaving all the time. And the host of the party, a guy who's calling himself Mr. Morris, says, is having these very strange conversations with the people that leave. He's like, "Oh, you know what? I might not be the Morris who you're trying to meet tonight. You might also check this other house where there's another man named Mr. Morris. He might be the one holding the party that you were trying to get to." It's very weird and kind of not Silas Q. Scudamore with the hole in the wall creepy, but what's he up to kind of creepy, It turns out what happens over the course of the night is that the number of people there dwindles until there's aside from Brackenbury and the host, there's 3 other people there. And it turns out, the head of the household, Mr. Morris, says something and it gets the other 2 people to leave. So now it's Brackenbury, the Mr. Morris, and one other guy whose name I didn't take notes of. It's not really important. But it's a very spy thriller kind of feel to it. It turns out that Mr. Morris is Colonel Geraldine, and he is collecting, effectively, seconds for a duel between Prince Florizel and the former president of the Suicide Club. They've tracked him down. And now Florizel, in order to kind of maintain his honor, is going to track down and, surprise the former president of the Suicide Club, but offer him, terms of, you may, duel with me with swords, or you may be executed for your crimes, but those are your two choices, kind of thing. And, this is the story where the sword fight is skipped over, because we get all this dramatic tension, and then we get all this stealth and intrigue stuff, and then they all go to this dark house where they're supposed to keep very quiet, and then they hand a box of swords, paired swords, to Prince Florizel, and then Prince Florizel leaves the area and comes back. He's like, "Nope, the deed is done." And it's like, "What? You didn't show it to us?" It's so ridiculously silly that I thought it was worth mentioning, because if you expected the dramatic tension that was rising in this to have some kind of a climax, in the end, the climax is kind of stolen away, and I think that's worth noting as kind of a weak point of this particular story. So now the former president of the Suicide Club is dead. The Suicide Club is completely disbanded. All of its members are gainfully employed now. So we move on to the next 4 stories, which are all titled under the Raja's Diamond. It's basically stories about the Raja's Diamond, which is a gigantic diamond that a Raja gave to a man, and it's basically the size of a duck's egg is how it's described. First story of the Bandbox. Harry Hartley is, in the same way that Silas Q. Scudamore, no, that doesn't work, because he's not creepy about it. Let's just say Harry Hartley is kind of a girly man. He is a total failure as a secretary for a military man, or a retired military man named Vandeleur. And that Vandeleur is the guy who owns the Raja's Diamond. So, but at the same time, the Vandeleur's wife kind of likes him a little bit, not in like a weird way, but like in a he does actually know what he's talking about when he talks about, women's dresses and stuff. So she hires him on as kind of like a lady's maid, but like the male version of lady's maid. And what ends up happening is that he gets mixed up in a plot to basically steal a bunch of Vandeleur's gems. We get this massive chaotic chase, which is probably the most action-packed chunk of the whole volume that I read so far, where she gives him a bunch of diamonds. She puts a bunch of diamonds in a bandbox. Doesn't tell him what it is, but she says, take this bandbox to this address and only give it to someone who gives you a receipt that's written in my handwriting, which is weird enough as it is. But he's like, well, okay, I guess so. He's not very smart either. That's another thing. And he's basically walking down the street with his bandbox, and suddenly Vandeleur is raging and screaming and running after him and calling him names and trying to stop him. And Vandeleur's wife's brother, who is the Charlie Pendragon, gets into a fight with Vandeleur to basically buy time. But like Harry is so like floored by everything that's around him that Charlie is like, "Run, you dolt," quote, "Run, you dolt," end quote. And so he goes off, he hides in a house, he keeps running, he's getting chased by Vandeleur. Finally, he's actually being chased by Pendragon himself as well. He kind of jumps into a garden to try to hide from the pursuers, and as a result, he meets up with a guy who basically steals half the gems from him, and then he runs from that guy as well, and gets pickpocketed by somebody else who takes another couple No, it's not even a pickpocket. He like trips and falls. The diamonds spill out like so much money in a River City Ransom, character, and then someone is like, "Holy crap! Someone just dropped a bunch of diamonds." Runs up, grabs 2 big handfuls of diamonds, and runs off. And we don't ever find out who this person is. He's just gone. But what happens with Harry is that he's eventually found by Florizel, and because Florizel kind of can talk to the police and say, "Oh yes, this guy was trying, he had no idea he had diamonds that were stolen, blah, 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 blah. He's innocent, he was the tool of such and such." And because Florizel puts his hand into the situation, Harry is kind of saved, and even most of the diamonds are returned. except for the two handfuls the guy grabbed and ran off with, and the Raja's diamond itself. Out of all the stories in this volume, I think this one was probably my least favorite because not that it was bad, but it was just so, like, it wasn't even silly. Like, it wasn't even funny. It was just kind of like a Mr. Bean episode, right? But not in a good way. Like, imagine if someone was just, oblivious to things. It has the obliviousness of the three imposters, which, was something that I thought was a weaker point of that story. But even though this particular story is kind of weak, it's actually necessary for the establishment of the next three, because the next three follow the Raja's diamond. In part 2, we have the story of the young man in holy orders. So, Harry Hartley jumped into this garden. The landlord who owned that house basically steals or tries to steal a bunch of the diamonds from Harry. Harry gets away, but in the confusion, Harry drops the Raja's diamond and basically kind of grinds it into the dirt with his foot. He steps on it or something like that, because nobody sees it until a reverend who happens to also be boarding at that house, his name is Mr. Simon Rolles, Rolles, basically discovers this diamond kind of covered in dirt. He's like, this diamond is huge. It must be worth a fortune. What do I do with it? And he is a man of the cloth. He's a priest, a reverend, right? And he has no idea what to do with it. So he's kind of like, well, maybe I should discover what criminals do to fence goods or something like that. But he has no idea how to go about it. And so we get a very comic story where he is basically walking around discovering that none of his friends have any knowledge how to fence or deal with big diamonds. So he's walking around and he finds a guy who's all, he looks kind of, he doesn't look like he's on the straight and narrow path. And that guy says, oh, if you want ideas on how to kind of establish yourself in a life of crime, you should read an author named Gaboriau. And so Rolles grabs a book on gems, on gem cutting, and also grabs a bunch of Gaboriau's novels, but he finds Gaboriau too vague. Quote, on his way home, Mr. Rolles purchased a work on precious stones and several of Gaboriau's novels. These last he eagerly skimmed until an advanced hour in the morning. But although they introduced him to many new ideas, he could nowhere discover what to do with the stolen diamond. He was annoyed, moreover, to find the information scattered amongst romantic storytelling, instead of soberly set forth after the manner of a manual. So, man of the cloth steals a big diamond. Nobody knows he has it. He's trying to figure out what to do with it, because he can't just sell the big diamond. People know what it is. And he's like, man, these novels are just not a manual for how to, cut a diamond and then fence it. Oh, well, right? But basically, as Rolles is trying to go to different places and go do different things, we are introduced to a character named the Dictator. He's not named the Dictator, but basically he's the brother of Vandeleur, and Stevenson usually calls him the Dictator because he was the former dictator of Paraguay for a while. But basically, the way that this story ends is that Rolles finds himself on a train in the same car as the Dictator. And then we have this very tense moment where Rolles is worried that the Dictator is going to, steal the diamond from him, even though there's no way for him to know that he has it. And Rolles, but at the same time, Rolles gets curious as to what the Dictator is doing, and he basically reveals himself accidentally to the Dictator, and they kind of come to an agreement that in exchange for some of the proceeds, the Dictator will figure out how to fence the Raja's diamond on behalf of Rolles. But we also are told that the Dictator himself has his eyes on that duck egg-sized diamond as well, and so there may be some shenanigans afoot in the future. Which brings us to the part 3, the third story in this series, called Story of the House with the Green Blinds. And we are introduced to Francis Scrimgeour, who is a very dull man who is given a very strange opportunity. Someone basically gives him a letter and says, you will receive £500 a year in perpetuity if you will do 2 things. Number 1, visit a certain theater in Paris on a certain day and sit in a certain seat. And number 2, accept the marriage to a stranger that will be determined by this would-be benefactor. Francis thinks this is all kind of weird, but what the hell? France, this particular theater in Paris is a short trip away. he may as well go. 500 pounds a year is a lot, or at least it was back then. And he ends up in Paris. He ends up kind of in a similar situation to Silas Q. Scudamore, but with none of the creepiness to it, in a sense. There's a little bit of creepiness, but not like a hole in the wall looking into a woman's room. The situation is a little bit more like what's that movie? Rear Window, right? Where he takes an apartment or in a hotel somewhere, and it overlooks this house that has green blinds, and that house happens to be the house where the dictator and the dictator's daughter, we're not sure exactly who she is during the first part of the story, are living. And he basically has a view of their courtyard through the leaves of a big tree that is in their courtyard that they have a table under so that they can sit and eat when it's sunny, right? It's, he's not creepy about it like Silas was, but it's kind of a similar-ish kind of thing. But basically, he's sitting there, he's looking out his window through the tree, and one day he sees Rolas go in there. He doesn't know who Rolas is, but basically Rolas screams and falls over, and he looks like he's dead. Francis jumps out of his window, goes down through the tree, and is like, "You killed that man," kind of thing. It's really weird and silly, while also being kind of, fun and adventurous at the same time. It's a weird moment in the book. And Francis has all these ideas in his head of, oh yes, the dictator there. He doesn't know who he is exactly, but he's like, oh, that must be my father. And that person, no, it must not be his daughter. Maybe that's who he wants me to marry, kind of thing. It's, he has this whole fantasy up in his head. In a sense, he's come up with these ideas in his head that may or may not be true, but he acts upon them no matter, regardless, and finds out that all of his ideas were completely wrong. The dictator is not his father. It turns out that the dictator tells him that he's a bastard son of the other Vandeleur, the one who originally had the diamond, and it turns out that the young woman who's been living at the same house as the dictator is not his daughter either. Yada yada yada, and also she refused. She would he says something like, "Oh yes, I actually pointed you out to her, and she said that you were you looked hideous," or something. Something to kind of totally just ruin all of the ideas that were in his head. And then we have Rolas lying there, and Francis is like, "But you killed that man," and he's like, "No, he's not dead, you idiot. Grab his feet, I'll grab his shoulders, we'll bring him into the house." Because the plan that the dictator has is to take the diamond from Rolas. But of course, things don't go quite as the dictator intends, and in fact, the daughter hands Francis the diamond and tells him to run. So we have another chase scene, not quite as good as the one in the previous, or in the first story, where Harry Hartley was being chased, but a little bit of a chase scene. And similarly in this case, Francis finds Florizel, and we get Florizel takes the diamond out of Francis's hands, and Francis gives it up willingly. He's like, I don't want anything to do with this nonsense. And Florizel's like, good decision, right? And we get this great tense scene at the end of the story where Florizel visits the dictator and Rolas and is like, look, you're not getting this diamond back. I'm not giving it to you. It's been the cause of too much chaos and crime and so on and so forth. And so I'm going to take care of it. And you guys aren't going to worry about it anymore. And the dictator's like, well, I already told the police that someone had stolen it. And Florizel's like, I'll handle that. Don't worry about it. And it's tense, but at the same time, the dictator is also someone who owes allegiance to Florizel, and so he can't really say no to Florizel either. It's a really interesting scene that I thought was really well done and fun, and that closes out the story of the house with the green blinds, leading us to the last story in the book, in this particular volume, which is called The Adventure of Prince Florizel and a Detective. Florizel basically takes Rolas on a walk. He's like, Rolas, look, the same thing, I'm going to tell you the same thing I told the dictator. This stupid diamond should not be in the hands of someone who is not wise enough to deal with it, because all it does is cause people to fight and kill each other over it and steal, and all kinds of crime and nonsense happens over it. And he finally convinces Rolas, you shouldn't try, you were a man of the cloth. You should not have dirtied your hands this way. You should go out to Australia as a colonist there, and you should just do some real, backbreaking work and forget everything about this, and you'll be safe there. And Rollis is like, fair enough. Okay, fine. And so Rollis goes off, and now Florizel is walking by himself with a diamond, trying to figure out what the hell he's going to do with it, when a detective walks up to him. And this is one of the shortest stories in the book, but it's still got a nice bit of gravitas because of the tension of that conversation between the detective and Florizel. It's actually really well done. And Florizel is too good to directly lie to the detective, so he kind of says, okay, walk with me and take me to the station. And they stop on a bridge, and at some point Florizel throws the diamond into the Seine River. And the detective's like, I'm ruined. You told me that you would go with me and help with the investigation, and now you've thrown the thing that I was looking for out into the river where we'll never find it. And basically Florizel ends the story and basically by saying, well, this is kind of the best way that this can go out. I'll make sure that you're not in too much trouble for letting me throw the diamond into the river. And, by the way, it'll be really fun to watch the dictator and Vandeleur, original Vandeleur, try to send people down to search the Seine River for the diamond, which they'll probably never find. And then the book basically ends. It ends with a suggestion that it ends with a statement that because Florizel was missing from his throne in Bohemia for so long, that basically the people had a revolution. They threw him up. They told him he wasn't the king anymore, and so he basically is. He could be anywhere. He might be working as a tobacconist in London or something like that. And that's kind of how the book ends, with kind of the suggestion that we may see Florizel again, but now he's lost his status, and maybe that'll have an effect on him in the later stories. I don't know. But that is kind of my spoilers on the 7 stories that I went through. I'll go through volume 2 eventually, and we'll see what happens on there. So let's move on to the conclusion. In conclusion, these stories were varied. There was a lot of different stuff going on in each story. They had detective story aspects to them and adventure aspects to them, and they mixed them up and Stevenson mixed them up in different ways in each story, which made them very interesting to read. They were mostly fun. There were a couple of issues with them that I took issue, with, I think he did this, could have done this better, or I'm not sure that I really like the way that this character is portrayed, kind of thing. The binding thread is kind of thin. We have the chase of the former president of the Suicide Club. We have the chase of this giant diamond. But in general, the binding thread is pretty thin, and we get different characters in most of the stories, where Florizel kind of takes a side position as a side character, basically. We get a little bit of lack of depth instead of digging into one particular villain or one particular evil organization. But we do get each story taking place somewhere slightly different at a slightly different time, and so we get some fun variety there. They are good adventure stories, and Florizel is an interesting, if a bit of a one-sided, not quite flat, but he's kind of a one-sided character. He's just the good guy. He just does nice things to people and tries to achieve justice, and he doesn't really have like a gray side to him like you would have expected maybe a bunch of a roustabout prince like him would have been. Which is not to say that he's a flat character. He does say some things that I think are philosophically interesting. There is a lot of good in what he says and does, and he tries to actually achieve justice in a way rather than kind of abandoning people who have made a few mistakes here and there. He's forgiving, which is a nice trait for him. This is an enjoyable, very fun collection of early English short stories. I went through this book like that. And it was really just easy reading, not too dark, not too light either. It has some good tension here and there, a good mixture of everything. It's really kind of like a big grab bag, you stick your hand in and you wiggle it around and you pull out something. And, there's going to be a detective story here. There's going to be a Rear Window style story here. It was actually kind of interesting, all the stuff where you can kind of see future things spewing out of the ideas that Stevenson had for these stories. I would say that anyone who likes easy-to-read adventure stories will love this book. If you want, however, if you want like big overarching stories and very detailed character arcs, you aren't going to find them here. At least not in this particular volume. Maybe we get more depth in the second volume, but I kind of doubt it. These stories were written to be, printed individually, printed serially, whatever, and they were printed over the space of about 4 years. So, the person who was reading one of them could not have been expected to have read any of the other ones, which is another kind of point in their favor. They all kind of stand independently. The Arabian author element thing is kind of just barely there, to the point where I almost wonder why it's there. Because, it would be one thing if there was a short preface where Stevenson's like, I got these stories from a blah, 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 blah. Kind of a toned-down version of the Burroughs thing, right? Or even a toned-down version of the intro to the Three Impostors. But we just get a paragraph at the end of each story. It's like, this is where my Arabian author stopped, and I didn't put in the parts where he kind of waxed eloquently about yada, yada, yada. This is a story that will appeal to people who like adventure and detective stories, not kind of dark horror and occult stories. Three Impostors was more along that line. This book is definitely kind of more in the adventure and detective kind of area. And, for someone who wrote about travels, about wide travels like Stevenson did, and who traveled a lot himself, this book is quite domestic. It almost entirely takes place in various parts of London and Paris, two of the biggest cities, in the area around where Stevenson would have been most knowledgeable. Still, despite the fact that this book has some minor flaws that I think weaken its overall impact, I still think it was really fun to read, and I'm looking forward to Volume 2, which I may pick up and go through in a month or two, something like that. Not like champing at the bit, but I'll definitely go through it and check it out, because I do want to see what Florizel will do now that he doesn't have a title and riches and all that stuff. Will he still continue to serve justice, and if so, how? Because most of the time when he did something to be like, oh, there is a problem here, the way that he got justice was by throwing his royal weight around, so to speak. And so I wonder what he'll do if he's not actually a prince anymore. So we'll see eventually. This has been The New Arabian Nights by Robert Louis Stevenson, Volume 1 of 2. 1882, containing stories written between 1877 and 1880. As always, thanks for watching, thanks for listening. YouTube stuff, if you want to help the channel, you can do all of that. And I hope you have a great rest of your week, and I will see you next time. Have a good one.